Hello learners, welcome back to this online study session on the Scarlet letter. So far we have discussed various aspects of the novel, and from those readings and discussions that we have had so far, one important point has emerged. There have been critics who have been reading the novel as a work of historical fiction, whereas there is another set of readings which sees the work as a romantic work of fiction. So in this online study session, we will look at whether the Scarlet Letter is a historical fiction or not. So without further ado, let us begin. Within the first few paragraphs of the work, Hawthorne seems to establish the action quite specifically in place and time. We are in colonial Boston among the first generation of Puritan settlers, those who emigrated from the old world to the new, as opposed to those who would later be born there. The topography is precise. The first paragraph says that in the vicinity of Cornhill, the cemetery on Isaac Johnson's lost, and round about his grave, a spot that subsequently the narrator goes on to say was to become the nucleus of all the congregated speculars in the old churchyard of King's Chapel. Not only does Hawthorne seem to know what he is talking about, scholarly research has shown that he did know, and that in all probability he had Caleb H. Snow's reliable work of 1825, A History of Boston, the metropolis of Massachusetts, on his table for reference as he wrote the Scarlet Letter. He had read widely in New England history during his sojourn in Salem between 1825 and 1837, but it is impossible to say how much of that reading carried out so long before the writing of the Scarlet Letter he remembered. Apparently, he did not take notes when he read, so we can only tell what aspects of the record impressed him by seeing what he did with it in his comparison of details indicates that in composing the Scarlet Letter, he used, along with Snow's book, Joseph B. Feld's The Annals of Salem, from its first settlement 1827, editions of Cotton Mathre's Magnalia Christi America 1702, and Wanderers of the Invisible World 1693, and probably an 1825 edition of John Winthrop's History of New England, edited by James Savage, the only text that identifies Mistress Hibbins as Governor Bellingham's sister. Every working writer quickly learns that a text must contain specific details if it is to make any impression on a reader at all. And from his opening reference to the grey steeple-crowned hats worn by Puritan men, to his description of Puritan holiday pastimes, wrestling matches, in the differing fashions of Cornwall and Devonshire, a friendly bout at quarterstaff, an exhibition with the buckler and broadsword, Hawthorne is doing what a good writer has to do. And upon investigation, we find that the details that he has scattered throughout the Scarlet Letter are not only striking and picturesque, but basically accurate. Yet, when we try to place the story exactly in time, the accuracy becomes illusory, precision vanishes. Hawthorne begins by saying that it is some 15 or 20 years after the settlement of the town, which is a careful gesture, one might say, in the direction of uncertainty, since 5 years of history can make a tremendous difference. Thereafter, he makes several mistakes that are most curious for one who was working closely with historical references. One datable historical event within the confines of the action, for example, is the death of Governor Winthrop. This takes place on the night of the minister's vigil. When standing on the scaffold, he sees a great A in the sky. Snow and other sources say that Winthrop died on 26 March 1649. But Hawthorne, who omits this year, carefully places it on a Saturday night. The next day is the Sabbath in early May. While offering reasons for the change in the month, scholars seeking for certainty have chosen to assume that the year should be taken as a fixed point in the narrative, although one might logically argue that one deviation from the record undercuts all other certainties. But taking June 1649 for the third scaffold scene, as we must since it occurs about a month after Winthrop's death, creates chronological problems. Hawthorne repeats several times that 7 years have elapsed between the opening of the story and its culmination. Therefore, we must date the first scaffold scene in June 1642. This is what many scholars have assumed, but it will not work. First, Bellingham, governor of the colony in 1641, was defeated by John Winthrop in the election of May 1642. Thus, he would no longer have been governor at the story's opening. He was again elected governor in 1654 and from 1665 to 1672, but neither of these dates fits the chronology either. Second, Anne Hutchinson has been expelled from the colony in 1638, a mere 4 years previously, and was not to die until 1643. The reference to her as sainted would thus seem premature unless the term has a specific and highly ironic theological reference, taking Hutchinson as one of the Puritan elect. Most crucially, since the Massachusetts Bay Colony was settled in 1630, and since we begin some 15 or 20 years after the settlement, 1642 is simply too early. Crude arithmetic shows that the action must start between 1645 and 1650, with the third scaffold scene taking place between 1652 and 1657. Thus, though Hawthorne has given us a 5-year leeway for the initial action, it is a leeway that definitely excludes the one specific event that we can fix chronologically, the death of Governor Winthrop. There are different ways of thinking about this fuzzy chronology. Most obvious is to say that although Hawthorne got much of his history right, he also got some of it wrong. With so much correct detail, he succeeds in evoking the sense of the times, and we do not need from a novelist what we would rightly demand of a historian. And indeed, since even historians make mistakes, it seems to be asking too much of any human being that his work be error-free. Another approach is to say that even though Hawthorne was liable to error like the rest of us, nevertheless, since he was working with historical sources, each deviation may have a purpose behind it, and we can then attempt to fathom the purpose in every case. Attempts have been made by Hawthorne scholars, and they have taken two directions. First, critics suggest that Hawthorne departed from the historical record for technical reasons to keep his plot smooth and the narration economical. Bellingham, for instance, did live at one margin of the marketplace, so that his midnight vigil Dimmesdale really could have seen him looking out of the window to bring several governors into the story and develop each character might dissipate its intense effect. Therefore, among several possible governors, Hawthorne chose this one. Similarly, if he wanted to end the minister's story at the scaffold in June, thus echoing the initial June scaffold scene, and if he also wanted to speed up the pacing towards the end, he would do better to put the midnight vigil later in the year than the month of March, when Winthrop actually died. In any case, given the New England climate, even an anguished minister might have thought twice about spending most of the night outdoors. Other scholars, however, quite reasonably point out that Hawthorne might as well have put the right governor in the wrong place as the wrong governor in the right place, and that a rationale for his deviations should be sought in a historical rather than a formal intention. For example, there is no authority for having Mistress Hibbins reside in her brother's house, assuming that Bellingham was her brother, as only the source does. She had a dwelling of her own as well as a husband until 1654. She was imprisoned in 1655, executed as a witch in 1656. A formalist critic might say that Hawthorne placed her as he did for the sake of economy, while the historicist critic would counter that he did it to correct Puritan law and Puritan crime, to show that these were two sides of the same coin, inseparable from each other. For the formal critic, the historical world is used by Hawthorne in the service of his fictional intentions. The historicist reverses these priorities and claims that Hawthorne uses his fiction in the service of his historical intentions, which are to provide a searching commentary on the early Puritans. There is a third way of interpreting Hawthorne's use of history in the Scarlet Letter, and this encompasses both approaches above, even though they might seem incompatible with each other. This is to assume that Hawthorne meant specifically to evoke the world of the first generation Puritans, but also meant to avoid any precision greater than that. As we all know, historical deviation into generations is useful, but necessarily imprecise at best, since people are continuously being born and growing old. We may suggest, therefore, that Hawthorne's deviation from the record are designed not to produce specific historical insights, but rather to generalize his history into an account of an entire generation's experience. Since there is no such thing really as the experience of one generation, Hawthorne has produced a composite, and as part of that composite, he has carefully made it impossible for us to come up with a sound chronology for the events of the Scarlet Letter. They take place sometime between 1640 and 1660. We can get no precise than that. But having accepted some degree of historical purpose in the Scarlet Letter, we must notice that Hawthorne's representation of key tenets of Puritan theology is wrong. Here I refer not to the after-the-fact judgments and analysis of the narrator, which are clearly of the 19th century, but rather to the religious beliefs and practices of the 17th century characters themselves. In the first place, the characters seldom speak of God, and of the 21 occurrences of the word in the Scarlet Letter, close to half of them are used in rather unorthodox, from a Puritan perspective, circumstances, as when Hester argues she has a right to pearl because God gave the child to her. The word providence, which we find 14 times, is used by characters and narrator alike, more often in secularized 19th century sense of fate or destiny than in the Puritan sense of a specific divine intention or intervention. There are no references to any particular personage of the Trinity, whereas the idea of the Trinity and the separateness yet oneness of its members was so basic to Puritan thinking. There are no references to grace, a concept that obsessed them, only 2 references to salvation and 1 to redemption, only 1 to the infernal pit in the sermon that Wilson preaches on the day of Hester's humiliation. The concept of the chosen or elect, who were also called saints by the Puritans, a concept closely tied to the idea of grace, figures only once in Reverend Wilson's imagined dream about the glorified saints. And the only election referred to is of the political variety. The ritual of testifying publicly to a conversion experience before admission to church membership is also mentioned only once, when Dimmesdale, returning from the forest, encounters a maiden newly won to the faith. Dimmesdale's public confession, which claims certain salvation for him, is from the Puritan point of view simply heresy. For Puritan theology was rooted in 2 related doctrines. First, original sin, Adam's disobedience to God's command, related in the opening chapters of Book of Genesis in the Old Testament, had marked all his descendants as sinners. The idea was not that people were all weak and capable of sinning, it was more ostracily that all people had in fact sinned. They were born sinners. Second, predestination. God had picked out certain people to save and had done so from the beginning of time. Therefore, nothing a person might do could affect his or her candidacy for salvation. This was all already ordained. Christ, to the Puritans, had come to earth to redeem only those who were elected or predestined. Behind these doctrines lay the tremendous awe and respect that the Puritans felt for divinity, which they expressed by stressing the enormous gap between God and humankind. To imagine that you could be good enough to deserve salvation was an affront to divine majesty. To imagine that you understood God's purposes well enough to know who should and who should not be saved was also presumptuous. In fact, Anne Hutchinson was particularly condemned for claiming that she had been enlightened as to who in the colony had been elected. For the original American Puritans, these difficult doctrines were the heart of a religious belief. Evidently, neither of these doctrines functions in the Scarlet Letter. Indeed, on occasion they appear to be specifically denied. "Wouldst thou avenge thyself on the innocent babe?" Hester asks Chillingworth, a nice 19th century sentiment, later repeated by the supposedly orthodox Dimmesdale and accepted by Wilson and Bellingham, when they considered taking Pearl away from her mother. The doctrine of original sin established that no human being, even an infant, was an innocent. Again, both Hester and Dimmesdale appear to believe seriously what no true Puritan could have believed, that no other human beings than they have sinned in the world, and the narrator praises them for it. A Puritan might think himself the worst sinner in the world, but obviously the doctrine of original sin made it impossible for one to maintain that only the self was sinful. Hawthorne's Puritans thus neither talk nor think like their 17th century models. Hawthorne has simply cut out the heart of their theology, making them much more like liberal Christians of the 19th century. In this more liberal context, the obsession with sin and evil, with sinfulness and sinners, floats about detached from the theological context in which it had its historical place, and becomes an inexplicable outcropping of the Puritan group psyche. Perhaps Hawthorne meant simply to say that Puritans were like that. Or perhaps, by detaching the concept of sin from its theological basis, he meant to emphasize the way in which the concept was used by the Puritan rulers for political rather than religious reasons. Thus, while we may certainly grant that some kind of historical commentary is part of Hawthorne's purpose in the Scarlet Letter, we have to realize that historical commentary is not equivalent to historical accuracy. Indeed, historical commentary often requires historical distortion in order to make its points strongly. And we have to remember that Hawthorne never presented himself to the world as a historian, but always as a storyteller or romancer, who intended to create fictional worlds that both were and were not true to actuality. Even if some of the historicist explanations are stimulating and intriguing, we cannot dismiss the probability that when he made intentional changes in the record, Hawthorne did so for the purpose of telling his story in a better way. His setting evokes the historical record without being committed to it, providing the atmosphere for characters who both are and are not beings in the history. And this discussion of the historicity and the accuracy of the novel then again brings us to the character of the narrator, that how is this character of the narrator positioned between these discussions about historicity and accuracy. So let us have a look at the analysis of narrator. So let us have a look at the analysis for the narrator's character and how he fits into this discussion of the Scarlet Letter as a historical fiction. The narrator is an inescapable presence in the Scarlet Letter from the very first. He is not a character in the story in the normal sense of that term, but he is very much part of the action because the action is constantly subjected to his commentary, interpretation, and criticism. In fact, it is often extremely difficult, if not impossible, neatly to separate out the narrator's commentary from his presentation and description of things in themselves in the novel. For a simple example, consider the report on Dimmesdale's thoughts as he stands on the scaffold during the midnight vigil. As he sees Reverend Wilson approaching, he beholds his brother clergyman, or to speak more accurately, his professional father, as well as highly valued friend, who is correcting his words here in order to speak more accurately. It can only be the narrator, and since the narrator might have spoken more accurately in the first place by deleting his less accurate words, his interpretation serves forcefully to remind us of his presence in the scene. Then when Dimmesdale imagines how the people would respond if they were to find him there in the morning, the text states that a dusky tumult would flap its wings from one house to another. This poetic image could not be Dimmesdale's thought. And when the A in the sky lights up the little town, the narrator withdraws from Dimmesdale's mind entirely, noting that one could see the wooden houses with their juttling stories and quaint gabled peaks visible, but with a singularity of aspect that seemed to give another moral interpretation to the things of this world than they had ever borne before. Not only is the comment about moral interpretation added to the scene by the narrator, as we can easily see, the adjective quaint must also emanate from his point of view, since no Puritans of the time would see their own roof peaks as quaint. This word establishes that the narrator is removed in time from the action, and it also suggests a point of view that we as readers would have of the action if we were present at it. The word is less an objective description of the scene than a description that has taken into account the perspective of the readers. Thus, the narrator serves both as commentator on and as reader surrogate in the story. And here is another way in which Hawthorne shows that reality is constructed out of points of view rather than existing independently of perceivers. Not all novels are told in this manner, even though all novels must be told. Sometimes novels are told from the perspective of a character within the world of the action, whether the main character or a minor one. Such characters are given appearances, histories, and roles to play. Sometimes novels are told through the perspective of one or more characters within the action, but with these perspectives filtered through a separate and disembodied narrative voice. Often, and commonly in the 19th century, novels are told more or less as the Scarlet Letter is by a narrator who is outside and above the world of the action, while taking a very active role in transmitting it. In such cases, it is natural to think of the narrator as a fictional representation of the author himself. Thus, sometimes we say the narrator and sometimes we say Hawthorne. There is nothing wrong in using these terms interchangeably in talking about the Scarlet Letter, so long as we realize that, as we have seen, that the narrator is not Hawthorne, in that he does not exist outside the confines of this one book. This narrator is finally a basic element in the atmosphere of the novel, an aspect of its setting. Whereas Hawthorne was a person sitting at his desk writing the novel with such motives in mind as paying his bills and becoming famous, the narrator has no other motive than to narrate. The views he expresses, the analysis he provides may or may not correspond with what Hawthorne, the human being, really thought. Thus, Even when we use the term Hawthorne for this narrator, it is important to realize that we do so mainly because we want to give the narrator a name and that it is the only possible name we can give him. But as soon as we give a name to the narrator, we begin to treat him as though he were a person, and that may be a mistake. We may want to identify the narrator with the biographical author because we value sincerity. We think a serious author should write from the heart, and we tend to take the voice of the narrator as articulating the beliefs of the author. Also, we want to find a secure ground for a correct interpretation of the story. We want the story to have authority, and we look for such authority in a narrator, especially when the narrator is free with analysis and commentary. Some critics of the Scarlet Letter, especially those who have concerned themselves with its historical accuracy or lack of accuracy, have suggested that the narrator, far from being Hawthorne's deputy, is quite unreliable and is therefore a kind of ironic figure who cannot be taken as securing the novel's truth. Such an ironic function, however improbable it may appear, cannot entirely be discounted. But it requires us to separate out the narrator from the text as a person, just the thing that we should not do. Certainly, the narrator, when offering specific views, may express an opinion that a particular reader finds hard to accept. In such cases, a reader may wish to resolve a different meaning in the story from the one the narrator seems trying to give it. When the narrator says that the letter has not done its office for Hester, or that in her solitude she learned much amiss, those who are attracted to her independence may wish to discount his judgment. Then, in many instances, the narrator does not provide a meaning or interpretation where readers might want one. For instance, he is silent about whether Dimmesdale's final confession is sincere, neither commenting on it in his own voice, nor telling us what is in Dimmesdale's mind at that time. Even if the narrator always tells the truth, so to speak, he does not tell us the whole truth. Many questions in the Scarlet Letter remain unanswered. Thus, one attribute of this particular narrator, if you take him as a person rather than a presence, is a frequent willingness to leave explanations open and a concomitant refusal to serve as an authority, a refusal to play the very role that a reader expects from the narrator. He pretends that the story exists independently of him and that he does not know its meaning any better than we do. The technique of multiple explanations, along with other strategies to create ambiguity, enhances our impression of his uncertainty. Since one of the things that the Scarlet Letter questions is authority itself, perhaps Hawthorne hesitates to establish an authority within the novel that must be accepted without question. At the same time, the narrator adopts an attitude of only partial authority over his narrative. He firmly places himself in the 19th century. From the very start of the narrative, he is constantly reminding his readers of the differences between the Puritan age and the present. There is absolutely no pretense that we are in Puritan times. In fact, there are continual references to the century in which the narrator and the readers live. The action of the novel may take place in Puritan times, but the act of narrating the story and of analyzing and assessing it definitely takes place in 1850. Such distinction between the narration and the events it tells creates an inevitable distance between the reader and the Puritans because it is always offering an alternate system of values from the Puritans. Thus, the narrator can play off each age against the other. And in general, 19th century values are shown as superior to Puritan ones, although the Puritans in some few ways were superior to the present. But as much as he stresses differences and change, the narrator also never lets the reader forget that these Puritans were our ancestors and that we live on the ground that they settled within the institutions that they established. Thus, even though he separates us from the Puritans in one sense, he connects us very firmly to them in another. One aspect of the narrator's 19th century demeanor that would appear to contradict his narrative openness is his constant tendency to moralize. The flower that he offers at the beginning is a sweet moral blossom, and the radiance of the supernatural A in the sky imparts a moral interpretation of the scene. Yet, the contradiction is only apparent. At the same time that he insists that the world has or should have a moral interpretation, the narrator is carefully weighing about what that interpretation should be. The moralizing is more rhetorical than substantive, a matter of good intentions more than of definite accomplishments. Such vagueness accords well with the desire to leave the story open rather than to close it within the confines of any single moral framework. In a sense, the moralism is embroidery on the fabric of the story, yet, just as Hester's embroidery of the letter cannot be separated from it, the moralism cannot be removed from the Scarlet Letter. In Hawthorne's day, many people were trying to separate morality from specific dogmas and doctrines, partly because the rapid proliferation of religious denominations in the United States threatened to create a kind of moral chaos, not to mention the real possibility of religious warfare. Americans could no longer afford to be intolerant, thus the idea of a transcendental morality, universal and attached to our common nature, emerged. Religion was losing its authority to legislate morality. The narrator's universal moral stance embodies such a 19th century view of morality as trans-historical and trans-doctrinal. Unity was increasingly to be a political matter, a question of the nation rather than a religious one. The distinction that the Puritans did not recognize between church and the state is a distinction on which the Scarlet Letter is morally based. In addition, the sweet moral blossom is offered to relive a story about human frailty and sorrow in terms that express compassion for human weakness rather than a judgment of human defectiveness. In fact, even to call a piece of moralism sweet or to imagine it as a blossom is to suggest that morality has a consolatory rather than a condemnatory role to play in human affairs. Along with his presentation of morality as something always and everywhere applicable, the narrator presents it as something sweet in and of itself. Thus, we can make a few firm statements about narrators' moral views, indeterminate as they generally are. No matter how he might sympathize with a given character's defiance of one or another particular temporal local formulation of a moral law, he would never accept a perspective that rejected the relevance of general moral categories for analyzing and understanding human life as well as for making human life tolerable. In other words, morality should be a category of understanding rather than a basis for judgment and punishment. Moreover, as a category, it must be grounded in the axiom that human nature, whatever it is, and in all its varieties, is common to all. The Puritans' worst fault, then, would have to be their exclusiveness, and yet this exclusiveness is precisely what had led them to the New World. The narrator is thus interpreting them against their own self-interpretation, performing an act that they would have rejected, that of integrating them into a view of common human nature. Thank you.